Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are heading into lesson 6 of our Tanya Chabura, and today, Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, we're going to conclude Perek Aleph, chapter 1 of Tanya. We left off last week with the clear recognition that on the outside, to the naked eye, the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni isn't apparent necessarily, but that the difference is really an internal one, whether they have a little bit of negativity that still exists within them or not, or they've eradicated the way it refers to David HaMelech, King David, that Libi Chal Bekirbi, his heart was devoid of any negativity. And with that in mind, we're now going to go into a topic which is foundational, not just for the rest of Tanya, and not just for the rest of your life to live as a Jew, but it's foundational to understand why we are not considered spiritual schizophrenics. Because some days, and sometimes more than once a day, many of us feel like we're inauthentic, or that we are being superficial, we're hypocrites, because one part of the day or 1 minute we feel one way, and 1 minute of the day we feel another way, and sometimes they're really opposing forces within ourselves. And if indeed we would only have one soul, and I'm specifically not saying neshama, I'm saying one soul, then it would really be we would indeed be dealing with a spiritual dilemma. But considering what the Alter Rebbe is about to teach us now, it's going to become very apparent that you are not a spiritual schizophrenic, that we are not spiritual schizophrenics, we're simply Jews on a journey, and once we understand the inner psyche, we'll be able to understand why we feel the way we feel on so many occasions. Says the Alter Rebbe as follows, Achbir Inyan. Now let us turn to the explanation. Alpi Mashakos of Reb Chaim Vital, Zichrein Livracha, Bishari Agdusha, based, whatever the Alter Rebbe is about to say between now and the end of chapter 1, is based primarily on what Reb Chaim Vital of blessed memory writes in Shari Agdusha, Ube'etz Chaim Sharnun Perek Beis, and in Eitz Chaim section 50, chapter 2. Who's Reb Chaim Vital? Just in case someone listening or watching doesn't know. So Reb Chaim ben Yosef Calabresi Vital, born in 1542 and passed away in 1620, was the, perhaps even more than his teacher, Reb Isaac Luria, Reb Yitzchak Luria, the Holy Arizal, was perhaps the most prominent figure in the Tzfat school of Kabbalah that flourished during the middle part of the 16th century. He was the closest disciple, student of the Arizal. The Arizal passed away in 1572. The Arizal wrote very little, and he passed at the age of 38, the Arizal. He was very young when he passed away. So it was primarily left to his prime student, Reb Chaim Vital, who took the responsibility of writing this complex, intricate system of Kabbalah, and everything that he penned, that he compiled from his teacher, from his Rebbe, the Arizal, it was called either Eitz Chaim, which is the tree of life, or Pri Eitz Chaim, the fruit of the tree of life, which is primarily on prayer and davening. Even after Reb Chaim Vital wrote down in Eitz Chaim and Pri Eitz Chaim all the teachings that he had heard from the Arizal, it wasn't really published in his lifetime. He had written manuscripts, but it wasn't until 1653 that in Mekubal, a Kabbalist in Yerushalayim in Jerusalem named Reb Meir Poppers, wrote it down, and it wasn't published. Listen to this. The Arizal's teachings in Eitz Chaim and Pri Eitz Chaim that Reb Chaim Vital wrote was not published until 1782. So now you think of the Alter Rebbe coming around and writing Tanya, and he's quoting so much of the teachings of the Eitz Chaim and the Pri Eitz Chaim. It's a fascinating concept. Furthermore, Reb Chaim Vital himself did write his own compilation. It was called Shari Agdusha, and in Shari Agdusha, it's really his own introduction to Kabbalah, with a strong emphasis on midos, on ethical living, living a sort of a musar, ethical living. And that was first published in 1734. I only share that, first of all, history and knowledge of who the authors are is always important, but I share that to understand that what the Alter Rebbe is going to share and elaborate on in the next section of the second half of, or the last third of chapter 1 of Perek Aleph, is primarily coming from the teachings of Reb Chaim Vital, which is from his teacher, the Arizal. What does Reb Chaim Vital say in Shari Agdusha, the great mystic? He says, The lechol ish Yisrael echad tzadik ve'echad rasha yesh shtei neshamas. The Reb Chaim Vital says that every person in Klal Yisrael, whether they are a tzaddik or a rasha, the most wicked or the most righteous, possesses two souls. And that's important because there was one Mekubal. He wrote a sefer called Chesed LaAvram. His name was Avram Azulai. He passed away in 1643, a very prominent Mekubal, who had a system of belief in Kabbalah that only a tzaddik has a divine soul. But obviously, Reb Chaim Vital's understanding of the Arizal was different, and it's the Alter Rebbe accepts that opinion that everyone, a tzaddik and a rasha, both have two souls. If you want to get a little more intricate, there's a third soul. It's not discussed in Tanya very much. It's called Nefesh HaMaskelas, the intellectual soul. It's sort of the in-between between the godly soul and the animalistic soul. But in the Alter Rebbe and Tanya generally refers to the struggle of the two souls, which is why we're just going to stick to that, because that's the primary understanding as we study through Tanya. So he says there's two souls. He says shtei neshamas. But then he clarifies and says what he means. He says shehein u'chilchsiv u'neshamas ani asisi. How do we know there are two souls? Because there's a verse. The verse says in Yeshaya and Isaiah, it says, Ki ruach milfonai yatov, when a spirit from before me humbles itself. And then he refers to that spirit, that ruach, which is said in the singular. He says, Uneshamois ani osisi. And I created in that spirit, I created souls in the plural. Which means we're talking about one individual, and this one individual has two souls. Now, in the Rebbe's commentary in Tanya Hasholim, and from other Rabbeim as well, it's discussed why did he pick this verse in Yeshaya and Isaiah? Why not a more prominent verse in the 5 books of Moses in the Torah where it says Vayitzer Elokim, where God created, and it says Vayitzer with 2 yuds, and the teaching is the 2 yuds teach us that there's 2 yitzarim, there are 2 inclinations in every person. So why not just take a more basic verse? Why do you have to go all the way to Isaiah, to Yeshaya, to find the verse that proves that there's 2 souls? And the explanation is very simple, and that is those verses refer primarily to the inclination, to the emotional attributes, that there's an emotional aspect of godliness, an emotional aspect of animalism, an animalistic soul. But by using the verse in Isaiah, which doesn't limit it just to the heart, but also includes the entire psyche of the person, it's teaching us something that the Alter Rebbe is going to elaborate later on in Tanya, which is that there's a eser kisrin the misavusa. It's not just the emotional, the 2 sides of the spiritual, the holy versus the mundane or the animalistic emotions, but it's also an intellectual battle. In other words, it covers not just the 7 emotional attributes or the 6 emotional attributes. It covers the entire gamut of the 10 spheres, both in the realm of Kedusha, the realm of holiness, and in the realm of the animal soul. So we know now that there are 2 souls, but that isn't enough. He says, Shehein shtei nefashos, that they are 2 independent souls in their own right. And why he needs to elaborate is because those of you that have studied mysticism, a basic premise in Chassidus and Kabbalah is that every soul, every godly soul, is made up of 5 levels. Naram Chai. I'm not going to get into all the details of what each level represents. It's not the time and place for it right now, but they are called Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. And one might think that if he says that the person has 2 Neshamas, it's referring to the Neshamas in the category of those 5. That in the categories of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, that somehow the Neshama of those 5 has 2 representations in the body. And in order to make sure that we don't think that that's what he's talking about, he says, Shehem shtei nefashis. I'm not talking about those 5 categories. I'm simply talking about 2 souls that come into every Jewish body, both Rasha and Tzaddik. And now that we clarified that, he says he's going to spend the rest of chapter 1 not talking about the godly soul, but talking about what we call the Nefesh HaBahamis, talking about the animalistic soul. And as you will find to be novel, I believe, based on my learning, that the chiddush of Perek Aleph and Tanya, the novelty of what the Alter Rebbe from the teachings of Chaim Vital emphasizes here at the end of chapter 1, is that even the animalistic soul of a Jew is different than that of a non-Jew. So what I'm about to say in the next 30 minutes or so can come across to people who aren't able to contextualize and understand what the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing. It could come across as insensitive, or it could be controversial, which doesn't necessarily scare me, but we're going to discuss what the Alter Rebbe teaches, and you need to understand it in the context of the Kabbalistic teachings of the divisions that exist within humanity, because we spent the first parts of chapter 1 talking about the divisions that exist within Klal Yisrael, right? We spoke about there's a Beinani, and there's a Tzaddik, and there's a Rasha. So just like there's divisions within Klal Yisrael, there's also divisions within the world, and those divisions sometimes include the division between Jews and non-Jews. But let's see where he goes with it. So he says this soul that we're going to discuss now, which is the animalistic soul, nefesh achas mitzad klipa. One soul stems from what we call klipa. So if you study Kabbalah, if you study Jewish mysticism throughout the Zohar, and then later, of course, in the Arizal's teachings, the forces of negativity in the world are referred to as klipa. Klipa means a shell or a peel. And our belief system based on Kabbalah is that deep inside, beneath the layers of the peel and the shell, there's the light. But in order to get to the light, you have to break you either have to break the shell or peel off the peel. And that's why here he specifically doesn't use the terms darkness and light, because darkness and light doesn't always necessitate breaking the darkness in order to attain the light. Over here, he's also trying to emphasize first that sometimes in order to find the light, you need to actually break through the barriers that the shell and the peel, the klipa, provide for you. Another term for klipa, another term for the negative forces in creation is sitra achra. And these are terms you need to pay attention to, because they're going to be terms that we're going to hear time and time again, both in Tanya and in all other teachings of Hasidus. Sitra achra means the other side. It's a term that comes from the Zohar. The other side of what? That it's not on the side of holiness. And it's a very important nakuda, it's a very important point. Because if someone only studies halacha, right? If you meet a beautiful Jew who spent 20 years in a yeshiva learning halacha and Gemara, they will know, because they're knowledgeable and studious, they will know that in halacha things are divided into 3 categories. There's things that are mutter, things that are permitted, things that are asr, things that are prohibited, and then there's rishus, there are things that are neutral. They're neither prohibited or permitted. They're just neutral, and that's very common, right? A sidewalk, a hike in the mountains. There are things you can do according to halacha that are permissible, and they were never even within the context of permitted and prohibited. They're simply rishus. They're permitted as aspects that halacha doesn't even need to dive into. But when you study Chassidus and Kabbalah, suddenly you discover that there's no third option. According to the Zohar, there's Kedusha, there's holiness, there's Klipa and Sitra Achra, there's the forces that are concealed, that you don't see the godliness in it, it's the other side. What about Rishus? What about neutrality? And obviously this is going to be explained later in Tanya, but there is no neutrality according to Kabbalah. Either you utilize the item for Kedusha, or you utilize that part of your life for the opposite. There's no neutrality, and that's where Chassidus and Kabbalah differ in the language that we use. It's very different than halacha. So something may be permitted according to halacha, but according to Tanya, according to Chassidus, according to Kabbalah, it's not really permitted. You have a choice to make. Either you're going to utilize it for holiness, and then it becomes holy, or you're not, and it's going to end up in the opposite of Kedusha. Where does this animalistic soul that comes from Sitra Achra and Klipa, where does it dwell? Where is its home? Says the Alter Rebbe, this animal soul is embodied in your blood, energizing your body. As the verse says in Vayikra Leviticus, the soul of the flesh is in the blood. What does that mean? It means that the dwelling place for the animalistic soul is in your life force. What does that really tell us? What it really tells us is that it's embodied within you. Why is that important? Because you hear terms, and I'm guilty of this because I've given shiurim before where I've used these terms, where we talk about the nefesh Bahamas, we talk about the animalistic soul as a demon, as a negative force, and we use terms like it's some little noise that's whispering in your ear as if it's some kind of outside metaphysical entity that's messing with your head. But the truth is, based on what the Alter Rebbe says here, it says it's not coming from the outside. The Nefesh Bahamis lives, is embodied in your bloodstream. It's in your existence. If you are alive and you are a Yid, whether you're a tzaddik or a Rasha or a Beinani, you are going to have a Nefesh Bahamis. Well, a tzaddik that eradicated it won't have it. But the average Jew, except for the minority of all minorities, will have a Nefesh Bahamis, an animal soul that's embodied in their bloodstream, and is not a voice coming from the outside, but it's actually just them, their own natural self that has tendencies for animalism. Which is a very important point because people so often beat themselves up. I can't believe that I would be so arrogant. Why not? Why can't you believe that you would be so arrogant? It's in your bloodstream. You have an animal soul that lives in you. Actually, as we're going to learn later in Tanya, and we have to wait for chapter 2 for that, and 3, is that the godly soul dwells in the animal soul. So they come across as one, but what is the primary home for the Nefesh Elikis? It's in the Nefesh Bahamis. So why are you so shocked that you're making choices or that you have inclinations or you have temptations for things that are unholy? You literally have an animal living within yourself. And says the Alter Rebbe actually goes into this quite beautifully. Says boys from this animal soul, which is directly in your bloodstream, in your body, all the bodily temperaments come from there. And that's, if you study Reb Chaim Miller's Tanya, which, he's beautiful in his translation, he actually says that this idea is the Alter Rebbe referring to the Greeks idea of the humors, the 4 temperaments. That, you have the caloric and the phlegmatic, the sanguine and melancholic, and that's what the 4 midas are referring to here, and he actually aligns them. Reb Steinsaltz, by the way, says, and I feel like it's nice to quote the people. Reb Steinsaltz, a brilliant Tanya scholar and a brilliant Torah scholar, says, back in the day, they divided up everything into the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth. But if you wanted to use more modern terms, you could also use the physics language of solids, liquids, gas, and plasma. But the reality is that the world, including our animal soul within ourselves, within our bloodstream, is made up of 4 elements, and our 4 temperaments come from there. What are the 4? So he says the negative men of boys kalamidis rois me'arba yesoidis roim shaba, that from the animal soul come all the bodily temperaments of the negative, and the negative ones stem from the negative side of the animal soul's 4 spiritual elements. So it's interesting. I just think it's beautiful to point out, because I always love when there's a syncing, where it syncs beautifully together. And the Tzemach Tzedek, I think, quotes it, and the Rebbe might quote some of it, that these 4, you see this number 4 play out with the negative elements quite a bit. For example, in Halacha, there are 4 levels of Tumah. There's an Avat Tumah, which is the father, the original Tumah, the OG Tumah, impurity. Then there's Rishon Tumah, Sheni Tumah, and Shlishi Tumah. And those are manifestations of the 4 negative elements. Then you have a very interesting teaching in Yalkut Reuveni, quotes the Rekanti, who says that when the serpent in the Garden of Eden brought Zuhama, brought filth to Chava, to the first woman, to Chava in the Garden of Eden, he brought Zuhama of Shtus, of frivolity, or of temporary insanity. He brought Znus, he brought a sexual illicit behavior. He brought Chemda Ra, negative temptations, and he brought Chatas, he brought sinfulness. Again, it's divided into 4. If you learn Gemara and you understand the Gemara has a spiritual element to it as well. In Nezikin, it starts of Arba Avos Nezikin. There are four primary forms of damages, reflecting the four negative elements. If you study other places in Kabbalah, it quotes the words Avoin, Mashchis, Af, and Chema, which are four negative terms used in certain biblical verses, and they're connected to these four elements. And then if you mamish want to go into the realms of Kabbalah, it's called Chachma, Bina, Tiferes, and Malchus of Klippa, the four primary forces of Klippa: Chachma, wisdom; Bina, understanding; Tiferes, the emotional attribute of beauty or harmony; and Malchus, kingship of Klippa. But these four elements that exist within your animal soul, that exist within your bloodstream, within your spirit of life, are natural to you. It's not a foreign agent that has plagued you. It's not that you need to have an antibody to deal with it. It's part of who you are. It's your nature. And Reb Chaim Vital talks about this, and the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing it. The Alter Rebbe is echoing what Reb Chaim Vital quotes there. How does it play out in your actual, right? Those are all nice, fluffy words. How does it play out in your actual emotional state? What negative traits, what negative midos are part of this natural animalistic reality? So he says, the Hainu, Kas v'gaiva miyasoida esh, namely anger and arrogance from the negative side of fire, the element of fire, right? Which shenag v'lamayla, reflecting that how fire's tendency is to rise upwards. So it's interesting. He mentions arrogance and anger, two terrible traits. The Gemara says, that if you get angry, it's like idol worship. And it says, when it comes to arrogance, God says, I can't dwell with you. So the number one primary, right, and the order here is very important. Because if you look at the order, fire is the number one because it's the worst. Anger and arrogance are the worst. The second one is temptation. We'll talk about it in a minute. That's pretty bad, but there's some room that you could channel those pleasures into something positive maybe. Then you have ruach, which is the air, and that is just really nothingness, so it doesn't give it as much emphasis. And then you have the last one, which is earth, which we'll talk about in a minute. But fire is the worst, because arrogance and anger are the worst. They burn you. It's called fire because they burn your core. And by the way, he uses two terms, right? What's the two main aspects of fire? Is that it's hot and that it rises. It burns you and it rises. And that's why there's two things: arrogance, which rises, and anger, which is a fire that burns you, that awakens like a fire within yourself. So the first issue that a person will see coming from his natural attributes, of his natural soul, from his animal soul, is anger and arrogance. And it plays out really with resentment as well. Why do people have resentment in their heart? People without arrogance don't have resentment. If they're humble, there's no resentment. People that seek power and honor, they want to show off to others, so then they're fully involved in this element of fire. And then hatred, because someone became better than you or greater than you, is another aspect of it. And then he says, the taivas atanugi misoidamayim, the gratification and pleasures which stem from the negative side of the element of water, ki amayim matzmichim kol minei tainug, because pleasures are ultimately cultivated from water. This is again from Shara Gdusha, from Reb Chaim Vital. So when you have jealousy and coveting because you have this unsatiable yearning for pleasure, it could be a very, very dangerous thing. Enjoying something in the proper manner, enjoying the pleasure of the world the way Hashem wanted us to, like the Gemara says, when you come to heaven, they're going to ask you, did you enjoy my world? In the right context, with the right people, in the right setting, in Torah mitzvahs, it's wonderful. But when pleasure is just for the sake of pleasure, one pleasure to the next pleasure to the next pleasure, which is what water represents. Water helps things grow, and it keeps growing and growing more and more enjoyable things, and I become jealous, and I start coveting, and I want what the other person has, it's dangerous. Then he says, he quotes four things that come from the element of ear. What are the four things? He says silliness, mockery, boasting, and other worthless discussions. By the way, which is included in that is also lashon hara. just talking about other people and gossiping. Who in their right mind, yes, it's your natural animal soul, but it's a negative. It's a negative because, first of all, you're speaking mockery, you're speaking silliness, you're wasting time, you're talking about others, you're gossiping. It's not where a Jew belongs. But that's part of the animal soul within us. And by the way, he uses the term here, boasting. Why is boasting different than arrogance? Because fire was arrogance, and over here with air, he calls it boasting. Because boasting is when you boast about virtues that you don't have. Arrogance, you could have arrogance about, I have great character traits, I'm very smart, I'm very good looking, I'm very wealthy. So it's still terrible, but it comes from perhaps a truth. Versus here, when it comes to boasting, it's about things that aren't true. And then he says the fourth one, the offer. And then you have laziness and depression that come from the negative element of earth, which is very interesting because the reason it comes in at number 4, because laziness could be a positive. How could laziness be a positive? I'm not encouraging laziness, but if you're lazy and you have a tendency to be lazy, you might be lazy to do sins as well. You're too tired to sin, you're too lazy to sin. Right? People that are depressed, sometimes they're too depressed to get out of bed. They don't even have a chance to sin. So there might be a bright side there. So that's why it comes in number 4. But generally, laziness and depression is a negative. But here is where the Alter Rebbe really comes with the Chiddush. That, again, it's the Chiddush from the Arizal or Chaim Vital, but I think it really opens up the door for a new understanding, not about what makes the Jew unique with their godly soul, but what makes the Jew unique with their animalistic soul. Because even within the realm of animalism, of temptation, of negativity, there's different levels. And it ain't all the same. Says the Alter Rebbe, the Gam midois toivish beteva kol Yisrael b'tol doisam, and also the positive temperaments with which the Gemara says all of Klal Yisrael are naturally born. For example, such as compassion and generosity, which the Gemara says that in Yevamis, they also come, boys, they come from the animal soul. Which means we're talking about your nature. Animal soul means your natural soul. And there are certain things Jews do that are good, that aren't necessarily coming from a place of holiness. They're just coming from a genetic part of what our animalistic soul, what our nature is. You know, you hear people say this all the time. Oh, you should see those Asian kids, the way they do ballet, or the way they do certain sports. Or you hear people say, oh, you should see the music that comes out of the Russian culture, right? It's embedded. Certain things are embedded in certain cultures, and in our case, if you're a member of Klal Yisrael, if you're a member of the Jewish people, which means you're a descendant of Avram, you're a descendant of Abraham, you have certain natural traits, not holy traits, natural traits, included Rachmanis, being merciful, compassionate, and being generous. That's why the Rambam says if you meet someone that's not compassionate and someone that's not merciful, you have to question whether they're actually a descendant of Abraham. What's pshat? We know that he might be with it. Something's wrong here because it's a natural thing that comes with your DNA. He doesn't quote the third thing, which is by Shonim, the Jews are shy. He doesn't quote that in Tanya because, as the Rebbe explains, that was something that came to the Jewish people after Matan Torah. It doesn't come from Avraham Avinu. It doesn't come from the founder of the Jewish people. Actually, it says in the Gemara that Jews are azin. We are tough cookies. Am kshei oiref. We have chutzpah. We're stiff-necked. Matan Torah, through the giving of the Torah, God gave us the ability to transform our stiff-neckedness and become more of a shy person. But if you're wondering why sometimes you meet Jews that are not so shy and they have a lot of chutzpah and they're very stubborn, stiff-necked, it's because they're not incorporating the Torah's values, and therefore they're not allowing it to make them the humble, shy self that they should be. So he only quotes the first two, which is Rachmanim and Goyim lechasadim, that they are merciful, compassionate, and that they are generous. So when a Jew does generosity, or when a Jew is compassionate, it's not necessarily coming from a place of the nefesh of the kiss of their godly soul, which is what we're going to discuss in chapter 2. It could be very much just coming to them by nature. They enjoy helping others, no strings attached. We just enjoy it. It's not about them. There's no ulterior motive. I'm just naturally inclined to do good. Some people are not naturally. For example, a Jew is not born naturally to be besimcha, to be joyous. A Jew is not born naturally to be an unav, an humble person. That's something they have to work on. But being generous and compassionate, that's something that's built into our system. Why is that so? Why does our natural system have that? So he says, and this is mamash the last section of Perek Aleph. He says, "Ki b'Yisrael nefesh hu deklipa himi klipas noiga shesh b'gam ki toiv." Because in the case of Jews, this animal soul of klipa, this nefesh habahamis, is from a thing called klipas noiga, the bright klipa. What is that? V'himisoid eitzadas toivara. This mixture of good and bad is come from the secret of what it says, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge was a makeup, a mixture of both. And so it had good, and that's where klipas noiga, that's what it represents. And for a Jewish person, their nefesh habahamis, their animal soul, doesn't come from a place of the shalish klipas atameis, which we'll talk about in a moment. It comes from a place called klipas noiga, the bright klipa, the bright negative force, because it has the ability for the inner brightness that exists within it. If you look, for example, when it came to the prohibition from eating from the tree in the Garden of Eden, it was only for 3 hours, which means it was a temporary darkness that allowed for light to come afterwards. And so we too, when we tap into klipas noiga, and our animal soul, the Jewish animal soul comes from klipas noiga, it has the ability to tap into a bright side, which is why we can have natural animalistic traits that are good, not just bad. We naturally or intellectually, we always assign animalism with negativity, but actually it means the natural state, and the natural state can have natural positive traits as well. And that's embedded in every Jew. So when it says in Yecheskel, when it says in the prophet Ezekiel, it says, Ruach Sa'ara, Anan Gadol, Eish Mislakachas, V'noiga Loi Saviv, which means a great cloud, flashing fire, a stormy wind, a great cloud, flashing fire, and brightness. The first three represent the Shalish Klipas Atmeis, the three impure Klipas, which, by the way, the three impure Klipas also have good in them. The only issue is we cannot access it. No matter how hard you're going to try to break the shell or peel off the peel, it's not breakable. That's why we don't interact with the shalosh haklipas atmeis, the three negative. That's why you're not allowed to eat things that are treif, for example, or wear clothing that are shatnas, because they come from the element of shalosh klipas atmeis, those three unbreakable klipas. But klipas noiga, but our animal soul, which is our DNA makeup of the Jew, it comes from a place that there's light as well. Right, Rabbi Steinsaltz says, aluminum exists. What do they call it in England? Aluminium. Aluminum exists in all parts of the earth, and yet, where do they actually mostly get aluminum from? From bauxite. Why? Not because there's more aluminum there than anywhere else. It's just more accessible. You can actually get it out of the ground. So it may exist somewhere, like in the Shalosh Klipas Atmeis, the three impure Klipas, but we don't have access to it. We simply don't have the ability to get through. We can't. The way Hashem created it, it was there. It was created in this world to give us the free choice, to see what negativity looks like, to see what transgressions look like and stay away from it. It's not elevatable, and the shell is not breakable, and the peel is not peelable. But Klipas Noiga, which has a brightness, which is where our animalistic soul comes from, that does have light, which is why our natural animal soul, which is embedded and embodied in our bloodstream, in our body, has good traits too. And here comes the punchline. This is not the case with the souls of the evil nations of the world. And I don't have the ability tonight, it's beyond the scope of tonight's class, but there are Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and commentary that talk about whether there's an emphasis here specifically on the evil nations of the world versus other nations of the world. But let's just say for now, nations of the world, in other words, non-Jews, they have a nefesh habahamis too, they have a animalistic soul, right? That's how they're alive. That's embodied in their bloodstream, but their animalistic soul. But as it says in Eitz Chaim, section 49, chapter 3, that the non-Jews, the idolaters' animalistic soul comes from the shalish klipas atmeis, the impure klipas that are devoid of the overt good that we know exists in klipas noiga. Now, I should mention right here, right now, that if you study Tanya properly, this is part of the contextualizing. This is not an apology towards, just the contextualizing, that there's a thing called Chasidi Yisraelim. There's a thing called the righteous amongst the nations. And the commentaries on Tanya, the Rabbeim emphasizes time and time again, even the Alter Rebbe discusses it in certain places, that the righteous amongst the nations, first of all, the Gemara says they have a portion in Olam Haba, they have a portion in the world to come. They wouldn't be able to have a portion of the world to come if they had a nefesh habahamis that came from shalosh klipas atmeis. So the fact that they have a portion of the world to come means that they have a nefesh habahamis, they have an animalistic soul that comes from klipas noiga, which is fascinating. Now, whether that's connected to following the 7 no-hide laws or not, I saw that in the Tanya Hasholim. There's a great discussion about whether that's directly correlated or not, but it's definitely part of the conversation. And perhaps as we get closer to the coming of Mashiach, there's more and more Chassidim Yisraelim. Just like we see bigger powers of evil that exists, perhaps there's more and more of the righteous, because to be righteous today and stand with the righteousness of Torah and the righteousness of Jewry is a harder job, which means anyone that's doing it perhaps is from the Chassidim Yisraelim that has the ability as a nefesh habahamis, an animal soul that comes from klipas noiga. So that exists. Which is interesting, because how does that relate to a ger? If someone converts to Judaism, up until, if you learn normally, if you study normally in Tanya, you think, okay, before they converted to Judaism, they didn't have a nefesh elokis, a godly soul, and then they converted, they go into the mikveh, they accept the Torah, they get a bris, and now they have a nefesh elokis, a godly soul. But according to what the Alter Rebbe explains it here, it seems clear that not only do they get a nefesh elokis, they also get a new nefesh habahamis, a new animalistic soul from klipas noiga, unless before they converted, they were already from Chassidei Yisraelim, and then they stick with their original nefesh habahamis, which was from klipas noiga anyhow, and all they're getting is a nefesh elokis, a godly soul. So it has an interesting side effect, if you wish, depending on where they stand before the conversion. And then he quotes the last words here. He quotes from the Zohar. It says, all good that the nations do, they do for themselves, which is really based on what the Gemara says. What does the Gemara say? There's a verse in Proverbs in Mishlei, the chesed l'umim chatos, that the kindness of the nations is sinful. How could kindness be sinful? Says the Gemara in Bava Basra, that according to Rabbi Gamliel, all the charity and kindness done by the nations of the world is sinful to them, since they only do it to put on, to create arrogance for themselves, to show off. Now the Gemara over there in Bava Basra gives 3 opinions. Over here he quotes the Rabbi Gamliel, but there's 2 other opinions. One is Lis Yair, one is to show off, one is Lis Gadol, to make themselves great, and one is Li Mashach Malchusan, to allow for their kingship and their kingdoms to have longevity. So they do goodness, so they should keep being liked and stay in power. But the point of all of them is that it's with an ulterior motive. And that's a big statement. Except I heard one of the masters that teaches Tanya says, is it really such a novel idea? Because actually, if you speak to most psychologists today in 2026, they will tell you that almost everything that people do these days is with ulterior motives. This one gives charity because that's what the club is doing, and this one does it because they want their name on a wall, and this one does it because his wife wants him to do it, and this one does it because it makes them feel good. This one does it to get a tax write-off. Everyone has ulterior motives of why they're doing it. The novelty is not that they have motives. That's actually normal. The novelty is that there's an ability for a Jew who has a nefesh habahamis that comes from klipas noiga to be able to be generous and compassionate without an ulterior motive, simply because they have a tendency, a genetic tendency to do good and be generous and be compassionate. And so yes, there are those, especially in today's day of the blood libels, where they love saying the Talmud of the Jews says this and the Talmud of the Jews says that, and they think the gut. I'm not going there. I'm not apologizing to them. The Gemara and the Zohar and the Eitz Chaim and the Tanya are good enough for me to create realistic differentiations between different parts of creation. And the last few weeks we spoke about the differentiation within Jewry between a tzaddik v'toivli and a tzaddik v'raloi and a benini and a rasha v'toivli. There's also a differentiation between a Jew and a non-Jew, and within Jews there are differences, and within Gentiles there are differences because there's chassidiyum u'so'ilam. There are the righteous amongst the Gentiles who make different choices, and therefore they have a nefesh habahamis, an animalistic soul from klipas noiga. And there are those that choose to live with ulterior motives, to live totally self-centered, and even when they're generous, it comes with a self-centered motive, and therefore it's shalosh klipas atmeis. And that's the end of chapter 1. So now we have an understanding that our nefesh habahamis isn't the enemy. It's the animal soul embodied in our bloodstream and has the ability to be channeled in the right direction because it comes from klipas noiga, from the bright klipa. And that takes a lifetime of work. And obviously throughout the next 52 chapters, additional chapters of Kutei Amorim, we're going to discuss how that works and how the struggle shows up and how the wrestling match takes place. But that has nothing to do with the nefesh elikis, with the godly soul that's unique to the Jew. But for the nefesh elikis, you'll come back next week in Mir Hashem for lesson 7, and we'll delve into chapter 2 to Perek Beis, beginning the journey of understanding the godly soul that is a gift to Klal Yisrael, and that will be next week. Be'ezer Hashem Yisborach, a good Erev Shabbos, and we'll see you back then.